Tom Aspinall was offered Stipe Miocic, who we thought was fighting John Jones. Tom Aspinall said, hey, I'll take it. And apparently Stipe's turned that fight down for UFC 300. So we could have had Miocic versus Aspinall for UFC 300. He's turned it down. Why is that? If that's true, why has that happened?
This makes me think about a lot of boxing storylines a lot of the time. You know, this is the thing that made me fall in love with MMA and stay in love with MMA was that the best fight the best every single time. You know, you could tune in pay-per-view after pay-per-view after pay-per-view and you'd see Chuck versus Tito. You'd see, you know, Randy Couture. You'd see like these guys at the top of their division fight each other, and all the way through Conor versus Aldo, Khabib versus Conor. You just get the best fighting the best, and that doesn't happen that often in any other sport because people are so protective of their legacy. However, in this scenario here, we're seeing with John Jones, we're seeing with Stipe, we're seeing two guys who are maybe exiting their prime with a lot on the line from a legacy perspective. And, you know, the truth be told is Tom Aspinall has looked like a world beater. You know, if you're going to protect your legacy, which is, I think, what they're thinking here is, do I want to risk it all with Tom Aspinall, or do I want to look at going out with a bang? And you've got to remember that Stipe is over 40, and one of the last times he got knocked out was by Francis with an absolute pile of
shot. Yeah, do you roll those mystic dice?
Yeah.
It's like, for me, what if I'm Stipe Miocic, what have I got to gain by taking out Tom Aspinall? Well, a lot, I guess, but really the fight that because everyone, we talk about Stipe,
not as much as John Jones.
Not as much as John Jones, but when we talk about Stipe, we always say the GOAT of the heavyweight division. Like, that's what Stipe is protecting. So, like, why am I going to step out there and fight Tom Aspinall when I'm already considered the GOAT? I would fight. I feel like for Stipe, for me, it feels like it's a legacy thing. To finish a career by saying, not only was I considered the GOAT of the heavyweight division, I also put away John Jones. John Jones is also on my resume as a victory. Tom Aspinall's risky. If you lose against Tom, the John Jones fight evaporates, and all of a sudden then it becomes Aspinall Jones, and Stipe's ends on a little bit of a whimper versus a bang.
Absolutely.
But he's been very, very patient on the sidelines, and he's not been that active. It almost feels like after his loss to Ngannou, he started becoming a bit more of a sniper with his fights and a lot less active. He didn't do that kind of... You know when Cain Velasquez got knocked out by Junior Santos with like overhand right? Cain Velasquez came back with a roar. He fought Bigfoot Silva and absolutely mauled him and said that I'm coming back. I am claiming that strap back. With Stipe, we've seen kind of the opposite of that. We've seen him just retreat a little bit and said, you know what? I did lose that, but actually I want to come back and think about my legacy. So if I'm Stipe, I can't say that I blame him, but that's what I expect his rationale to be.
Absolutely. I mean, you can't help but think the public is really sort of like what's happened recently. And Stipe's been out of the picture a little bit. But if Stipe comes back and convincingly beats John Jones, I feel like that would erase the Ngannou loss just a little bit.
Yeah, agreed.
You know, and that brings him back into that conversation, because if you look at what Francis has gone on to do, like if I had to ask you right now, who is the GOAT in the public's mind between Ngannou or Stipe, how much do you think that the public are thinking about what Ngannou's done in the boxing realm financially, in throwing 2 Vs up to the UFC? Like, who else has stood up to the UFC and won? It just doesn't happen, bro. So, you know, if you get Stipe come in here and take the narrative, beat John Jones, the GOAT who's never lost a fight other than a technicality, you know what I mean? He essentially has a chance to take John Jones' and cement himself in that Hall of Fame for all time. I
mean, Ngannou's not satisfied with just being people in a corporeal realm. He's now going to step in and fight institutions and classes and continents and sandmat. I mean, like, when's this guy going to give us a break, bro? He's like, oh my goodness, guys, someone stop this man.
They just announced him versus Magnus Carlsen for a chess match.
Chess match, yeah, absolutely, mate. He is everywhere these days. But I feel like, yeah, Stipe wants to take John Jones's... but man, I don't know, man, I feel like that's a brilliant fight for them both to finish on. John Jones, I feel, because he had those really tight negotiations with the UFC where he kind of just sat back on the sidelines for a bit. He looks around at boxers and he sees how much Anthony Joshua, Tyson Fury is making. He's thinking, bro, there is no more dominant champion in MMA than me, and look at my paycheck, obviously a lot of money anyway, but nothing compared to boxing. I can't blame him for wanting to fight for a better salary. But from the fans' perspective, we lost big time, because when he fought, it was amazing to see, like, the spinning elbows. It's just techniques, his creativity, and we lost 3 years of that because he's fighting for a paycheck. Mate, very, very sad, man. Like,
the tension when a Francis Ngannou fights, because you know it can end at any
second,
moment.
Any second.
I do feel like the the work of Francis Ngannou and the work of Conor and the work of Nate Diaz and on all of the and Ronda and all of these stars is starting to pay dividends. Because there was a story released recently, I don't know if you saw this, that Khabib actually turned down $40 million to come back to MMA. I think that's a testament to Khabib's character, but also I think that's a testament to where MMA is going as a sport. You know, if you rewind 10 years, the idea of a UFC fighter being offered $40 million, you know, unless it was a boxing match, it's unheard of.
Not happening.
Unheard of.
Not happening. And you know as well, you train, you've got like a light heavyweight fighter on your roster. Light heavyweight divisions typically have been pretty slim. If I'm the UFC and I'm thinking, look, let's look at where we want to be in a 10-year time frame. We know that heavyweights, on average, tend to draw more in than some of the lighter weight classes.
Absolutely.
Superstars excluded, right? I'm thinking they need to almost get in the NFL mentality. But how do we invest in these heavyweight athletes 10 years prior? Get those ultimate fighters, get those guys that would be going into basketball, would be going to NFL.
Absolutely.
And show them, bro, like, not only can you make a lot of money in MMA, dude, you're going to make more money than ever. It's just at odds with maybe the way they set it up financially. But I feel like if they really invested in getting that top-tier heavyweight talent, we'd be looking at a lot of superstars in the next 10 years.
You know, I'm going to sort of talk about a bit of more of an opinion piece than anything really factual here, but if I was the UFC and I was thinking, how do we break into that type of thing? Like, the thing that the UFC have done really, really, really well is they've been promotion first. They've always been, we'll build around the promotion and we'll not build around the star. So you know about the UFC, but in boxing, you know about Joshua, you know about Fury, you know about Usyk. It's not the promotions, but you know, they've really tried to make sure that nobody's bigger.
True, actually, yeah.
Nobody's bigger than the UFC. And whilst they're breaking into these new markets, particularly Africa, that continent has the potential to produce some real stars. You know, as a lot of the guys who've come from there have done incredibly well. You know, so I think maybe it'd be worth investing in heavyweight talent in Africa, like talking about growing your fighters through the different networks and the PI that they're going to build over there and all the rest, like really building that division up. Because if you've got a pay-per-view and there's 10 title fights, it's going to be the heavyweight or the light heavyweight at the top of that, regardless of who it is.
That is genius. I mean, why put yourself in a position of NFL or UFC? Why not just go to an economically disadvantaged area of the world compared to the US? Because US is like top 3, isn't it, in the world? And just give resources and access to people that have it. Say, hey, if you want to be an MMA fighter, you can be. How cool is that? Like, that'd be amazing.
And it's an investment. It's an investment. We've seen the UFC go from $50 million in the hole when the Fertitas bought it. It was sold for $4 billion, and recently I can't remember where I see it, so forgive me for not citing sources, but I've seen a price tag of about $8 billion put on it. So it's still a growing commodity. It's still growing. It's the fastest growing sport in the world. It has been for 20 years. You know, laying those foundations just seems like a no-brainer.
It does. And the one question I want to end this segment on is the UFC about the best fighting the best, or is it about making the best fights possible?
Man, I think it's about making the best fights possible for the UFC, you know. And so, how do you quantify that? It's definitely not about the best fighting the best. Otherwise, they would have bent over backwards to keep Ngannou. Okay, it's the best fight for the UFC, the legacy of the UFC, the negotiating power of the UFC, and they've shown they're happy to let people walk. They're happy to let Francis Ngannou walk because it's not what's best for the fighter, it's what's best for the promotion. It's always been that, from revenue split, from promotion, from every aspect you could possibly imagine, from the way that they liaise with certain managers. The UFC is about what's best for the UFC, and it always has been, and it always will be, until there's a reason for it not to be like that. And so far, the business model has looked like it's essentially doubled and every single year, with the company growing exponentially. Why would you change what already works?
Well, let's be honest. You made a good point of that. We love the UFC. They keep growing. Obviously, it's work. But if you look at 5 promotions, I feel that is a sliding scale of, do we have the best guys fight the best guys? Do we have the fights that people want to see? Sometimes they're the same thing, but it's almost a point of differentiation. So a Bellator or PFL, somebody else can decide to differentiate on, do we put the shareholders first? Do we put the fans first? Do we put our fighters first? We've seen the PFL now say, look, our point of differentiation is we put the fighters first. That's how the PFL want to differentiate. So look, yes, we'll make money, but actually to capture market share, we believe our model is if we give the fighters the best amount of money, not only is that a point of resonance with the audience, but fighters want to earn more money, therefore they come to us. And as soon as you, excuse me, I'm not whistling, I'm getting that excited about it, but as soon as you change in people's minds where the best fighters are, that's when UFC loses its stranglehold in the market. That's the one secret truth the UFC cannot lose. They cannot lose the perception that the best fighters fight at the UFC. That's why you'll never see a UFC versus PFL. That's why they won't do that sort of stuff. They have to have the perception they're the best. Otherwise, it doesn't work.
Absolutely. You know what would be really interesting is if you could... It would be really interesting to see how Dana's mind would work if he had the option to choose between star material and the best. Do you know what I mean? To see how he would match all of that up. Because, you know, well, we've seen it. We've seen, like, Conor didn't fight a dominant wrestler until Chad Mendes, do you know? And when he did fight Chad Mendes, it was on extremely short notice, 2 weeks of notice, do you know what I mean? And that gave him the best chance for success. Now, was that contrived? I'd say probably.
Well, I mean, like, the WWE and UFC now sit in the same company. I don't think that's a coincidence. I feel that the UFC are becoming like Disney. The UFC are story makers. They think about careers, not just in fights, but also in terms of, like, what's the background? We've got this guy from the sand mines of Cameroon, and he comes in, and he's a knockout artist, and he's doing that. Dude, you want to tell me there's no thought or intellectual planning or strategic planning behind these storylines? I think it's a complete lie. I think for sure some of them, the storylines just drop in their hands, and then, you know, they run with it. And other times, I think there's a whiteboard somewhere in some UFC office with markers on it and things going on in the background. And why not? Like, we love storylines. It gets us invested.
Yep.
Like, I mean, the
Sean Strickland, perfect example.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
Perfect example of a guy who's gone completely viral from having what is essentially a really, really intense story. You know, and it's played out in the public with the podcast with Theo Von, where he opened up a little bit more. It's played out with the threatening to stab Drickers, you know? And, like, a storyline is really what people latch onto. Because, like, let's be frank, you know, Sean Strickland's skill set is not the best in the UFC. It's not the top of the tree. It's not the absolute top. Do you know what I mean? I know he's just hit the championship, but you know, you compare him to, say, a John Jones and how well-rounded John Jones is. You're not expecting... Is Sean Strickland going to shoot a takedown tomorrow? Probably
No.
not. Is Sean Strickland looking to sub you off his back or sweep effectively? No. He's going to stand up and he's going to punch you in his face.
And but the annoying thing with that is, like, I feel...
Your face.
If Sean... Say again, bro.
In your face, not his face.
Yeah. I feel like with Sean, if he would shoot the takedowns, if Sean Strickland would throw head kicks and teeps and add a couple more moves to his arsenal, even if he doesn't want to win just to show it, just to get them thinking, my gosh, I feel his dominance level would go up like 300%.
It's hard
Because if you're Dreykus, you're like, very tough fight, very difficult fight, but you know you're not really thinking about the takedown, because Sean's based his reputation on, I'm not going to be a bleep, I'm going to stand in the middle, we're going to bang. Absolutely. So Dreykus doesn't, it's like a half of, all of Dreykus' attention can then be on Sean's core game. He doesn't need to think about anything below the waist, essentially, from a wrestling perspective.
Yep.
I'm just going to expect these 4 or 5 combinations.
Yep, 100%.